United States is a relatively large nation, 48 contiguous states stretching from one ocean to another, and Hawaii, a veritable paradise which we acquired with a super peaceful hostile takeover. This was the last state to enter the Union. But what about right before that? Alaska, home of ice bears, and Sarah Palin. How did America, with her amber waves of grain, fruited plains, and purple mountains majesty, come to own this? As with many odd parts of America's history, we turn to the Russians. No, not those Russians, but rather the Kingdom of Russia, led by an emperor. In the 1740s, Russia began to send small bands of fur traders from the Russian Pacific coast to Alaska, which they cleverly named Russian America, where they discovered Alaskan native populations and the amazing sea otter. Keeping in tradition with the history of European settlements in America, it wasn't long before these fur traders discovered how sea otters made awesome coats and how native populations were an excellent source of labor to force into slavery. Initially, this was extremely profitable for the Russians, but as is the case with all things Russian, the situation began to deteriorate. The natives began to resist being enslaved and many staged open revolts. Combine this with the fact that the sea otter population had steadily declined, despite coats being at an all-time high, and the region was quickly on the verge of an economic collapse. What could possibly make this situation worse? The British. Hot off a win against the United States in the War of 1812, the Brits decided it was time to invest some more attention in Canada, moving eastward until they encountered the Russians. The British, who didn't have to deal with angry natives or underfunded traders, began to pump out sea otter pelts like a well-oiled machine. Russian America was now an embarrassing net loss for the Russians, who therefore decided it was time to ditch it altogether. So the Emperor of Russia approached the brand new U.S. President Abraham Lincoln to try to sell him Russian America. Lincoln, understandably, was preoccupied. He also didn't really want anything to do with the otterless icescape of Alaska. Meanwhile, the British had decided that they were going to lay claim to the waterways of Russian America. Not wishing to engage the British Navy, the fur traders agreed. Back in America, Lincoln visited Ford's Theater, and soon President Johnson took office. Now is a good time to meet Johnson's Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward took a great deal of interest in the possibility of purchasing Alaska from the Russians, not the least of which was because, you guessed it, the British. The British were eagerly eyeing the property and needed only the money to pay for it. And Seward, growing increasingly nervous of the massive British influence in Canada, spoke to Johnson about buying the property. Johnson, likely too busy being the worst ever, agreed, and the Russians, eager to let go of Alaska, sold it for a steal, only 2 cents per acre, for a total of $7.2 million. Adjusted for inflation, this works out to be about 50 cents per acre, which is still a bargain. Ultimately, history has deemed the purchase to be a smart buy for the United States, as shortly after the sale was made, oil and gold were both discovered, which is likely little comfort to the guy who just lost several $1 million selling sea otters.